Dave, you want to go to the first slide? I was last here to talk about Ukraine in May. Nothing's happened. But some of the issues I talked about in May of those chickens are coming home to roost. We're going to talk about today, where are we now? And we'll kind of go through all these things. And I want to go through this fairly quickly to bring people up to speed, but I want to leave time for Q&A before everyone comes out of Sunday school and so on. The punchline up front is that Putin is playing all-in poker. He is going all in, and the downside of that is that he will not win, but he is eliminating by his own actions almost every off-ramp, every escape route. So this is going to be a very dangerous time. I'll go through all these things, but that's the big thing we're going to talk about is just where are we now? And next slide. And what can we expect? And the answer is, I don't know. But I don't think victory or defeat or negotiated outcome or even escalation beyond Ukraine are inevitable. So I don't know where that leaves us. But it will be, or Russian regime change. None of these is inevitable. We may find ourselves with just a slog of war. Next slide. All right. You don't even have to read the slide. I just want you to blur your lines, blur your eyes and look at the colors. This is the 15th of March, and all that red is stuff that the Russians took in the first 3 weeks of the war. Next slide. A month later, they didn't have any of that stuff in the north anymore. All that blue area is what Ukraine took back by the middle of April. Next slide. When I was here in May, that's where the war looked like. And if I'd given this talk in August, which I did somewhere else, the slide didn't move. Now, next slide, this is as of day before yesterday. And you can see up in the north, and I'll give you better pictures in a minute, up in the north near Kharkiv, that's blue area is what Ukraine has taken back. And there is fighting along the entire front in Kherson province in the bottom, and I'll show you a little more close up. But I just wanted to give you this sweep of how things have changed. Next slide. So these are the two main battle areas going on. On the right is Kharkiv up in the north, and you can see all that blue around Kharkiv that the Ukrainians have taken back. And there is fighting along the main front of Donetsk. And the point of this is that, as I'll show you in a second, is that the Ukrainians keep making progress. It's a slog. It's brutal. The Russians are retreating, some of them just fleeing, leaving aside brand new tanks included, which the Ukrainian army has just captured. But alas, they're also discovering places of torture, mass graves, and so on, as the Russians have retreated. And on the left is in the south in Kherson, and this is critical for a variety of reasons, but one of which is that this is really the gateway to Odessa. We can talk about the details of this if you want to, but I just wanted to give you a sense of where things are on the battlefield. Next slide. Putin is raising his stakes. The map on the right, the map is actually, the battle lines are as of about the end of September, but it doesn't really matter. What you see are the 4 provinces that Putin, at the end of September, decided to annex. That includes the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, which in February he had said, or actually before February, had recognized as independent statelets. No one else recognized it except Belarus and Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Syria. It's a great company. And then the other two, the Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts, were part of Ukraine. He has now annexed all of those, just like he annexed Crimea in 2014. The significance of that is that Putin has basically said, you're all Russians now, and I'm going to defend you no matter what, just like any other Russian. So this is how he has raised the stakes. We will not negotiate about you, and we will defend you. You are our citizens forever, which is to say the people that are left. These were referenda with 88 to 98% of the vote, but remember that most people had actually left. Next slide. He's also raised the stakes on nuclear threats. That's always been in the background, and I know that's what's on a lot of people's mind, and we'll come back to this in Q&A, because I'm not going to answer all your questions on this. He has already said, don't attack us. If you attack us, then this is what we might do. Well, now, Ukraine has already crossed that red line several times. They crossed it early on when there were some explosions within Crimea itself, which Russia views as has annexed, 8 years ago. And then the blowing up of the bridge. There's a fantastic video in the New York Times this morning about the one land bridge between Crimea and the Russian mainland that was blown up by a Ukrainian car bomb. Presumably the videos were taken by somebody who was complicit in that, driving right behind the car bomb, because it's really fantastic video if you get a chance to look at it. But my point is, Ukraine has already crossed that red line, and we, the West, has said to Ukraine, and particularly the United States, has said to Ukraine, don't use any of our equipment to do that. And the Ukrainians have said, we're not. And they're doing it in their own somewhat creative ways. Hardliners in Russia are advocating the use of nuclear weapons. The Russian kingpin of the Chechnya area has said to Putin, this is what you need to do, and some other generals have said this. So there's some hardline responses on all of this, as well as protests in the streets. But do I think this is likely? No. And we can come back to that in Q&A. It is very possible that as Putin is pushed to the wall, that he will feel like he needs to up the ante. And I don't rule that out. I don't think anybody rules that out. Would it be rational for him to do it? No. Did I think invading Ukraine in the first place in February? I gave a talk about a week before the invasion and said it would not be rational for Putin to do that. So, my understanding of Putin's rationality is obviously flawed. I don't know what he is rational in the sense that he has his own frame of reference, and therefore what seems logical to him will be rational. So, it wouldn't be rational to anybody else. He's already made so many miscalculations. These steps of upping the ante are more miscalculations, so I wouldn't rule out this further miscalculation. Does that necessarily mean, what kind of strike would it be? Who knows? Could it be blowing up a nuclear power plant? Well, he now controls the one in Zaporizhzhia, which is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, and has been supplying all of the bulk of Ukraine's electricity, but that's been shelled off and on for the last several months. They have, again, I think this is now the third or fourth time they've cut off all power to the power plant. So the only thing that's happening to keep the reactors from melting down is just internally generated power off of generators to keep the reactors from melting down. But the problem with doing that is that this is in Russia's own supposedly annexed area, right? Zaporizhzhia. And where does the radioactivity go? Prevailing winds are from the west. So we're going to radiate our new citizens. So I don't know how this fits into Putin's mindset, but I don't think that this is likely. Another possibility is, I think the likeliest possibility is some demonstrative use of nuclear weapons. That sounds very arcane, right? Analytic, it's like us, we who have studied nuclear weapons for the last several decades, this gets really, really ugly and arcane very quickly. But simply to say, here's a low-yield nuclear weapon going off someplace in a field, we're not radiating a whole lot of people, although there's still radioactivity and it's going to blow east. But it's a way of saying, I'm getting desperate, don't you do any more, right? It's a terror tactic. It's a scare tactic. What is the West likely to do? I find it very unlikely that the West, the United States, would use nuclear weapons in response. We don't have any nuclear weapons in Europe, except for some bombs that have been in storage since 1992. We don't have any nuclear-tipped sea-launched cruise missiles. The only nuclear weapons we would be able to use in any ready way would be strategic, which we're not going to use. And the real point is that we don't need to. So my guess is, and I don't have any inside information, but the administration has been saying, many ways, kind of like voting in Chicago, early and often, right? Mr. Putin, if you do this, there will be huge consequences for you. And this, I think, may be the ultimate deterrent for Putin. Because the most important thing for Vladimir Putin and any other autocrat is his own regime, the survival of him and his regime. And this is the one thing that would really endanger the regime. Now we, the United States, NATO, and the West have had a lot of balancing acts all along. I talked about some of them in May. Of being firm but not being provocative. Trying to find that balance point of how do we do what we can do to help Ukraine without provoking something really stupid on Putin's part. So we have not engaged, we have not used our weapons to target strikes in Russia or Russian claimed territory, or at least in Crimea. We have not used, we are not engaged directly in combat. Neither we nor any of our NATO allies are engaged in combat directly. We have been restrictive in some of the weaponry we've given Ukraine. We've said no to certain kinds of, like ATACMS, a long-range missile system, that we have said to Ukraine, no, that would be too provocative. It would give them a capability of striking into Russia. The artillery that we give them cannot strike into Russia, well, unless they get close enough to the Russian border, obviously. But we have been very restrained all along not to provoke Putin into doing something stupid, and so that's the balancing act that has to play. Are there clear signs of what exactly would provoke? No, we don't know what those red lines are, right? A point of history. We've had two major wars in the 20th century. One of them, World War I, the lesson of that war was be restrained, don't escalate, make room for diplomacy. Because World War I was the war that nobody wanted. Is that me? What's that? Switch to the other hand. It's right here. Hopefully we won't. How's that? So the lesson of World War I was be restrained, don't react, don't escalate. What was the lesson of World War II? Restrain and not escalating and not using force and not standing up to an autocrat brought along a Second World War. So here's the problem, folks. We have two major lessons from the 20th century, each pointing in a different direction, and it is up to policymakers to figure out which one we're in. I happen to think we're in the second one, where it's important to stand up, not to reward Putin. but he's going to try and scare us. I think the most likely response would be the use of conventional military power, probably by the United States, initially allowing the Ukrainians to target strikes in Russia, possibly using U.S. conventional military power, along with other allies, to strike targets directly related to Russia's war capability within Ukraine. In other words, you broke a red line, we'll break a red line too, but we're not going nuclear. I don't know what's going to happen, but that's the likely thing. When people say, well, this would lead to Armageddon, as Biden said, and it could. But I think that's Biden clearly saying we're not going there. That we have options other than escalating to nuclear use. And I think that's the principal point I want to make. Next slide. Energy cutoff. I think we missed a slide in there too. I want just to remind you about the mobilization that Putin took place on September 21st. I'll just stay on this, but there's another slide, doesn't matter. Putin went out and drafted 300,000 people on September 21st. A bureaucratic mess up. I mean, they were starting to conscript. It was only going to be to call up reservists who had had prior military training. They get a little refresher and sent to the front. And that you had 18-year-olds being conscripted who'd never been in service before. You had people being called up who were elderly. You had people being called up who had medical excuses and so on. It was a bureaucratic mess. It's going to take time before any of those folks show up in any number on the force, on the front. And no one thinks they're going to add materially to his capability because they're not going to be well trained. But it's indicative of Putin's own problem. I mean, he's already lost, best estimates, roughly 80,000 of his active military, which is about 30% of the active military that started this war. That's a lot. There's been a huge brain drain. There has been since February. And they've now had about over 200,000, about 250,000 people have left the country just since September 21st. Flocking to Finland until Finland closed the border, flocking to Georgia. You don't need a visa to get on an airplane to go to Istanbul, and so on and so on. So the long-term effect of this for Putin is really bad because he's losing his population, the educated, younger population. By the way, the sanctions are also hurting, not so much because we're targeting oligarchs and all that kind of thing, but the long-run effect of the sanctions is that the Russian manufacturing sector has largely shut down because they get all their parts from the West. So their manufacturing sector is pretty much shut down, and that, ladies and gentlemen, will take years to recover. So Putin is essentially killing his own society. He's also killing his economy in another way because his principal source, to get back to this slide, the principal source of his revenue is oil and gas. The Chinese are willing to buy it. They need it. But if you're the only real customer, do you think they're paying full price? I don't think so. We could talk more about the Russian-Chinese relationship, but the punchline is that Russia's the junior partner in that relationship. This is not the 1950s and 1960s. They're the junior partner in this relationship. And yes, the Saudis and Russia and the rest of OPEC have cut production so that they can increase the price because the Saudis are going to play transactional politics because that's what they do. And that's a whole nother conversation. But in the oil and gas field, I mean, it is Europe that really cuts. I mean, the statistics are up here, but the punchline is that Europe is very reliant on Russian oil and gas. However, on the oil front, there are other sources of oil. There are other sources of gas. They're more dependent upon gas than oil. But the European Union has already said, oh, you're going to boycott us? Well, no, we're not going to buy it. They've already agreed to cut off 90% of oil imports from Russia by the end of 2022 and to cut it off entirely by February of 2023. So they're already making plans. The Germans, fascinating story in itself. Social Democrat Green Coalition, being very hardline on Russia, shut down Nord Stream 2, which was about 90% ready to go online. That's the Nord Stream 2 pipeline up there, and the Nord Stream 1. The Nord Stream 1 has actually been pretty much out of commission for the last few months. It was under maintenance, and then Putin said it was under indefinite maintenance. And then we had bubbles in the Baltic Sea, sabotage of somehow, but I still can't fathom how that worked for anybody's benefit, because the Russians could have just turned it off anyway. But that was largely supplying gas to Germany, which was almost entirely dependent upon that gas. But there are other pipelines going online. There is liquid natural gas that is now being exported from the US to new facilities built on the Baltic coast. And they've been filling up their gas fields a long time for reserves. So Putin is banking on Europe freezing over the winter and cracking. And I don't think that's going to work. All right, next slide. If Putin went into this war because he was claiming NATO enlargement and so on, it didn't work out very well, because NATO is now 2 countries bigger. Finland and Sweden are both in it. Well, we're still waiting for a half a dozen countries to ratify it, but it'll happen. And for all practical purposes, they're in NATO. The important part of this is that these are 2 countries that have centuries of tradition of neutrality. Sweden has been neutral since the Napoleonic Wars as a matter of policy. Finland had an agreement with the Soviet Union that it would never join a bloc that was hostile to Russia. So those have all gone by the wayside. And these are countries that have recognized a fundamental change in the geopolitical reality in which they live. There is a new strategic concept at the NATO summit at the end of June. And the point of that is simply to say, they haven't had one in 2010. They did not have one after 2014, when the first Ukraine crisis started. But this one specifically calls out Russia for its violations of international law, violations of war crimes, and calls it a direct threat for the first time since the end of the Cold War. And for the first time refers to China at all. Although there was a debate whether to call it a threat or a challenge, and the moderates won. It's called a challenge. I used to negotiate communiques. They're always a lot of fun playing with words. But the point is that there's been increased support by NATO and the NATO allies individually to Ukraine, as we've seen, and to frontline NATO members in case Putin decides to escalate. In 2015 and 16, NATO had created this Readiness response force, because it basically hadn't been doing anything for during the post-Cold War years, and said we would have a 40,000 force ready to move. It's not like they were there. That's been up to 300,000. Now that doesn't mean they're all there. That means that the infrastructure's got to be built and so on, but those are the plans. And oh, by the way, along the way, the United States has doubled its military presence in Europe. We are now back up to 100,000 military personnel in Europe, when we were 20,000 about a decade ago. Next slide. Allied military support for Ukraine ours is huge because we're the big elephant in the room. Germany, France, and the UK have been strong in many ways. France less than most. Public opinion remains strong. However, there is this, but we don't want to escalate this thing. So that's the balancing act. And that's what politicians have to worry about. I'll skip the details here. Next slide. And interestingly, last week, right after the annexation, the announced annexation of these 4 parts of Ukraine, Zelensky applied for fast-track membership of NATO. He just did it about a couple months ago for the European Union. And what's particularly interesting is that those 9 countries in green all did a joint statement that said, and we support that. And they're all frontline states, or in the case of Montenegro and North Macedonia, the 2 most recent members of NATO. But otherwise, it's all the frontline states except Viktor Orban's Hungary, just in case. But you recall that this is in response to a 2008 Bucharest summit, NATO summit statement, thanks to George W. Bush, who insisted that it say that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, but it never gave a time. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon because it has to require everybody's agreement, and all the other allies have. Nobody said no publicly, but what Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, said, well, it's not. We're not really focused on that right now. We're focused on providing Ukraine the ability to defend itself, and that's the very pragmatic line. And the Germans have said, well, yes, in the long run, we'll have to have some kind of security guarantees, but we're not saying what they are. So there's going to be some dodging going on about this, but the stakes are clearly rising on both sides. Next slide. So challenges ahead. There's consistent rhetorical support for Ukraine. There is consistent military support, but there's increased concern, obviously, for how do we have some kind of an off-ramp here, but there isn't one that's clear. Public support is high, but again, that may be tenuous over the course of the winter, and so on. Next slide. But I think here's the important point. Not since the onset of the Cold War, and many of us in this room were there when that started, and I've been studying it my entire career. Not since the onset of the Cold War has there been a need for such solidarity in the West. And so far, at least, we still have bipartisan support for all this. Maybe the only thing we have bipartisan support for in the United States. Next slide. So, conclusion, and then we'll go to Q&A. Putin has gone all in. And he's basically eliminating every possible way of getting out of this thing. Next. Can Putin win? Not unless we let him. Next slide. Can Zelensky win? Not unless we help him. Next slide. Are there any negotiated outcomes? Unlikely, unless Putin decides he really needs a fig leaf to get out. But he's not there yet. Next slide. Can this escalate to nuclear war? Possibly, but not likely. But, Putin's mental state is a wild card. Next slide. Will Putin survive? Every time Russian leadership has changed, it's been from the inside, not from the outside. John Bolton yesterday, former National Security Advisor, someone with whom I probably disagree on almost everything. Bolton said yesterday, we need regime change in Russia. Well, just play into Putin's own talking points. If there's regime change, it'll be because the Russians decide there's regime change, not anything we're going to be able to do. But it's also not clear who would replace him, right? It's not like Putin's been grooming a successor. There's Navalny, he's in prison. I mean, maybe there'll be an election and he'll come out, and I don't think so. So it may be more of the same, or maybe just chaos. It's not necessarily, as we've all learned, as the United States has learned when it did practice regime change, be careful when you create a political vacuum. Someone might fill it, and you might not like who fills it. Next slide. These will be trying times and dangerous. And with that uplifting note, somebody said, I want to leave church happy today. I don't know how I can do that, but that's my brief update to where we are. And I think we still got some time for Q&A. And Lisa, I think I can. Yes.
Mariupol, what's going on in Mariupol, and what's the access to the sea there for Ukraine?
Access to the sea. Well, Odessa is the principal access to the sea, which they still have. Mariupol is ruins. I mean, the Ukrainian army, it's not right on the sea, but it's close to it. And the Ukrainians basically, and along with a couple of other places in Donetsk, Severodonetsk particularly, and the Ukrainians finally left, and the Ukrainian commander said, there's nothing left to defend. So the only folks who are there are the folks who are kind of diehard Russian, separatists. And there's not that many of them, but they all voted for the annexation. I can't, yes, Bill. There you are.
So 2 questions. One of them is Germany going to turn on their nuclear power plants again? That's one question. The other one is, at least temporarily, and then the other one is in Italy. They just had a very conservative government come in, and are they expected to fall in line with the rest of the EU, or are they going to be a problem?
Great questions. One, nuclear is an option in Germany. I don't know the mechanics of how soon they could be able to mobilize that, because nuclear has been off the table in Germany for a long time. I mean, Scholz has said we may have to revisit that. I don't know how, I just don't know the answer about how quickly that could be reconstituted. I don't know that Germany's had kind of active operational nuclear power plants just waiting to be turned back on. Maybe somebody else knows. But my understanding of it is that Germany's basically said 9 to nuclear, and now that's going to have to be a process, a long-term solution. There are a lot of longer-term solutions to the energy issue, but the long-term consequence of this for Russia is that as Europe weans itself off of Russian oil and gas and indeed accelerates its move to renewables, pretty soon Russia won't have a market. And that's going to be difficult for them. So at almost every turn, demographically, politically, and economically, Putin is destroying his own country for the benefit of his own supposed legacy. The second question was Italy. Yes, new prime minister in Italy who has a background of kind of playing with fascist movements and was adoring of Benito Mussolini and so on and so on. But she's a hardliner on Ukraine. Now, so it's not like the Italians are providing a whole lot, but they certainly are a voice within the European Union. Italy is totally, so I don't see a problem, at least with respect to Ukraine. I can see a lot of other problems. But Italian governments don't stand around very long, right? And Italy, as much as she is a populist, Italy is totally dependent upon the European Union, which means that when Macron calls, she'll take the call. So I'm not really worried about that. And by the way, so we talk about regime change. Boris Johnson is no longer prime minister. Liz Truss seems to be messing up everything about the British economy, but that's another story. But at least on this issue, she's a very strong hardliner on support for Ukraine. So I don't see Allied support wavering, except some of the smaller allies that are not on the front line, but they're not contributing very much. But they also don't have a lot of leverage that they're going to stand in the way. The only one really standing in the way is Viktor Orban. But at the end of the day, he's dependent upon the EU and NATO as well.
This is probably a very naive question, but early on when the Russian troops were moving in, there were articles that said that when the bodies started coming home, the Russian mothers and grandmothers would rise up. Right. Is there any hope for that home front getting organized?
Excellent question. Some of the mothers and grandmothers are rising up, but not very many, which is why there's not a conscription, which is why there has not been a major mobilization that many of the hardliners are calling for. Because that is precisely what happened in the 1980s in Afghanistan, when that war dragged on and more soldiers were coming home, 18-year-old brand new conscripts who were just cannon fodder, and they were coming home and mothers and grandmothers were in the street. And that was what got Gorbachev, along with a lot of other things that he was trying to do, realize he needed to head that off. And that's precisely why I believe that Putin has not ordered a major mobilization, which is what the hardliners are arguing for. But even with this partial mobilization, because it was so poorly done, it was supposed to be, okay, you used to serve, so okay, we're going to serve you your papers. But it was very arbitrary and capricious. People who were getting papers that shouldn't be getting papers. And moms and grandmas were saying, wait a minute. And there was one story I was reading yesterday that somebody got to the Georgian border, was trying to escape, along this long line of cars, right? And they actually walked the last 10 miles after taking a cab to the Georgian border. And then when they got to the border, this one guy got let through. They only asked him why would you have friends in Georgia? But the other guy was delivered, they took his passport and they served him conscription papers right on the spot. So it's like, who knows? It's just left up to individuals. But that's a long-term danger for Putin, which he's going to avoid if he possibly can. And that's his problem. And if I were advising Zelensky, I would say keep doubling down as you're doing, because this is the hardest time for the Russians militarily at the front. And they're looking to winter to reconstitute. And for some of these 300,000 so-called reservist conscripts to make their way to the front, to add to the bodies. But don't hesitate on that, because they might end up, they might crack. Over here. Yeah, thanks for pointing, because the spots I can't see the hands going up. Yes, there you are.
Hey, thanks, Sky. This has been very, very good. How effective is this call-up going to be, given that it seems like they're having trouble with logistics to supply anything to these bodies, much less a major full mobilization? And how would you characterize the state of the Russian military in general, which seems to have been very overestimated at the beginning of the war?
Overestimated at the beginning and all the way through. You're absolutely right. I mean, there are stories of two soldiers sharing a gun, right? I mean, these are anecdotal, so I mean, I don't know anybody's in a position to do a major study on it, but there are too many anecdotes like this of equipment just being abandoned, of soldiers not having enough weapons, certainly not enough ammunition. I'm not an expert on the Russian defense industry, but people who know a lot about it, who've forgotten more than I will ever know, tell me that compared to Western defense industrial capacity, the Russian defense industry just is not capable of producing, anything in the kind of supplies that they need, whether it's not just tanks and things like that, but, ammunition. They're running out of precision-guided munitions because they can only produce a handful a year. And so their supplies are very limited, and our supplies are not. So that's really what's happening. It's an old Russian playbook of just mass at something, but it's also a highly bureaucratic top-down system, so that, we got troops, but we don't have guns, and we have guns, but we don't have ammunition, because that's another department. And the biggest thing that has, as you alluded to, the biggest aha from this whole war is that the Russian military might that we imagined, those of us who lived through the Cold War, it's a Potemkin village. It doesn't exist. And that is the difficulty that Putin faces. Now, whether he realizes that, I don't know. How much he is being told about the real state of the Russian military, that's kind of everybody's question. There are increasingly people on the inside who are saying this is stupid and we can't win it. But there are other people on the inside who are saying this is stupid, you got to double down. So where Putin comes out on that, I don't know. But at the end of the day, more bodies on the front just simply going to become cannon fodder because they're not going to be able to fight. And with the training that they'll have, having been called up against their will largely, at the first sign of here comes a highly motivated Ukrainian army, they may just turn and run. And so that's the conundrum here. You've put it well. Yes.
one of the things I understand is that this has been presented as some sort of holy crusade. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yes. This is excellent question. This is a holy war for Putin. It has been the case since Putin took over Russia in 2000 that he has viewed, and I think I talked a little bit about this in May, but that he has viewed the resurgence of Russia as a nation, not just as a state, but as a nation, a civilization, as a millennium-long calling. And you heard that if you heard any of his speech on the 21st and on the 30th, the big teletrons and so on, is that he was pounding his fist in the air about all of this. And the Russian Orthodox Church has been happy to oblige. Obviously, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has a different view. But I mean, for example, when he talks about this Russian 1,000-year history, well, 1,000 years ago, Moscow was a little settlement. Kyiv was already 700 years old, with a government, with a structure, with a castle, with a bishop, with a king, right? So let's get our history straight here. This is not some inferior thing, but this is what he's created. And by the way, Alexander Dugin is one of his principal advisors, wrote a book back in '97 about the geopolitics of Eurasia, but basically reinforcing this geopolitical notion that it is Russia's destiny to control all of Eurasia. And the biggest impediment to that is a Ukraine that doesn't want to go along, right? And remember the car bomb that blew up? That was his daughter. And in the news recently, we U.S. government has speculated that was the Ukrainian intelligence operation, a clandestine operation, which it probably was, and that it probably was not well advised. But at least it's interesting that we publicly criticized them about it. But they were trying to get Dugin, and they ended up getting his daughter, who was just as way off the bounds on that as well. But this is a holy war supported by the church as part of Russia's destiny. And that relationship is an interesting one that goes all the way back. I should point out to you an interesting anecdote that even in the Soviet Union, when the church, we were atheists, right? The church was no good. And during the Great Patriotic War of World War II, Stalin essentially jettisoned all the Marxist-Leninist stuff, started renaming Russian tactical fighter squadrons and tank squadrons and armored units after Russian Orthodox saints as a way of promoting this notion of what really motivates the Russian people to defend themselves. It wasn't Marxism-Leninism. It is this sense of Russia as a holy nation, the Third Rome, and all that stuff that you read about in high school. It's all there. Thanks for the question. John.
Is there a concerted effort on the part of Western diplomats to provide Putin with an off-ramp?
That's an interesting question. A concerted effort, no. You hear from different political leaders, probably Macron most of all, to some extent Scholz in Germany, the recognition that there needs to be one, but not that anyone has one. I mean, you and I could sit and conjure up possibilities. But this action and what the Ukrainians have gone through since February essentially takes any, let's do a ceasefire and you get to keep this. Essentially takes it off the table. Zelensky has said from day one, not a single Ukrainian, not a single square centimeter of Ukrainian territory. And Putin has now said, oh no, this is all Russian territory now. So he can't give that back up after a speech in which he says, you're all Russian citizens now, and I will defend you just like I defend anybody else in Russia. This is that same religiously driven civilizational concept about the Russian nation. So the answer is yes, everyone is trying to figure out what kind of off-ramp might exist. It's not concerted because there isn't any possible, I can't conceive of one. I could have conceived of one in February. I could have conceived of one in 2016, but not now. The biggest threat to Zelensky's power in Ukraine is giving up too much. And at this point, giving up anything might lead Ukraine to throw out Zelensky. And then you get like a German stab in, post-World War I German stab in the back narrative going on, right? So that's the real danger. And that's why I say Putin's doubling down has essentially eliminated all these possibilities. We cannot, personal opinion, we cannot, as much as I would like anyone else, like to see this war come to an end, we cannot let Putin win. And for him, winning is international recognition of what he has taken by force, not only this year, but in 2014. I mean, that would just go against everything that we have said we believe in. So that's the bad news. Yes. Great questions.
I have one comment and a question. I heard either on the BBC or NPR that liquefied natural gas was a great longer-term solution, but more immediately, basically the infrastructure wasn't there. And something we might forget is it takes very specialized ships to transport it. And I think they said there were only 4 of them, 4 or 5 that exist. So the time to build those ships and the facilities to liquefy the natural gas and then do it the opposite. So just something,
I'll come back to that in a second.
Keep in mind. And then a few of us gasped a little bit when you talked about, you said America doesn't have the nuclear weapons, and then you clarify.
In Europe.
Clarify. Oh, is that, see, and then you said we have the strategic. So that was just, maybe some, clarification.
I'll come back to that one. But you're right on the liquid natural gas, but it's not a new discovery. In Corpus Christi, Texas, I went and gave a talk, 8 years ago. They already had created a liquid natural gas terminus for the export of it. So in a sense, we've had that capability, not strong, not on the East Coast, but it's at least in the Gulf. They have been building in the coast of Poland coast for the last couple of years, a terminus, and it's I don't know if it's operational. I think it's operational. There are 2 facilities, actually. One of them is where they can offload the LNG, and then they have to take it to another facility where they turn it back into gas, because from liquid back into gas. So you're absolutely right. The logistics of this, the infrastructure is very specialized and not very common. But it does exist, and we have been delivering some amount of LNG. It's not an all-in solution, but it is helping. Along with the biggest thing is filling up the gas fields with supplies of gas so that they can use it over the winter, and then distributing that very carefully. The second biggest thing is there is a Baltic pipeline that is being built. It's supposed to come online, I think, in February or March, but sometime in early 2023. And that will be another source of natural gas. So there have been efforts, even before this invasion, to try and not be so dependent upon Nord Stream. But you're right, it's not something, it's like turning into electric cars, right? You can't just drive everywhere without an electric car. Great question. On nuclear weapons. Yes, we have strategic nuclear weapons that are based in the United States and on submarines that are designed to do very nasty things, and that is to deter Russian use of nuclear weapons. We have like less than 20% of what we had 30 years ago. We will not use those. I tell you right now, we will not use those. Those are for deterrence of a Russian attack on the United States, and we're not going to touch that. So what do we have? We have, not since George H.W. Bush in 1992, in his nuclear initiative, we have no operationally deployed nuclear weapons anywhere in the world other than the strategic nuclear stuff. We took the nuclear cruise missiles off of ships in 1992. We took all the nuclear weapons out of Europe in 1992, except for a few hundred bombs that have been sitting in various countries' storage, largely as a way of having those countries have a role in NATO's nuclear response. It's more politically and symbolic. The Europeans, some of them are going to buy F-35s, which have a dual capable. They could do a nuclear mission, but they don't have them now. So it's not like these things could just be pulled out tomorrow and uploaded and off we go. But the most important thing, I think, about the U.S. military over the last several decades is a major effort to find other ways of doing the things that militaries do. Right? Destroy stuff with precision so you avoid as much collateral damage as possible. To destroy stuff with precision and firepower without having to use nuclear weapons, because that's what nuclear weapons did for you. Right? They allowed you to be very destructive with one weapon, as opposed to, World War II, scores of bombers, most of them getting shot out of the sky so that you can take out a bridge, right? So there is a capability. We have conventional military capability with high amounts of precision and firepower without using nuclear weapons. And that would be the tool that would be used, given a political decision, to use those weapons against Russian targets, however you define Russian targets. That's going to be the big question. But my sense is that as an outsider, but having studied this for a long time, that is my sense of what would happen if there were a Russian use of nuclear weapons of any kind. There would be a punitive and militarily significant use of conventional military capability against Russia's already staggering military capability, principally logistics and supply areas, bridges, and so on, that the Russians rely on to get stuff to the front. And basically say to Putin, that was stupid, and you just lost a lot of your real military capability. Do you want to keep playing? And if I were advising Mr. Biden, he's not asking, but if I were to advise Mr. Biden, that would be my answer. I hope that helps.
So I think we're about ready to close down, except for personal questions. I
hang around.
I have one little question.
Yes.
Because I'm in charge. So.
That's the latitude of the chair.
How about Norway in terms of supplying natural gas and oil?
How about Norway? Yes, Norway provides a lot of natural gas to the European Union already. Britain does as well, because of the North Sea. And so yes, and by the way, speaking of Norway, there was an attack on it was a cyber attack on its infrastructure last week. So there is, behind the scenes of all of this, cyber attacks on energy infrastructure in Europe. And this is another area that could, if it escalates, could get difficult. Because NATO has already said, Article 5 of NATO says an attack on one is an attack on all if there is an armed attack against a NATO member. NATO has several years ago said, by the way, armed attack includes cyber. So if there is a major, this would be a political decision to escalate, but at some point, given all of this, if there are really significant cyber attacks by Russia against NATO infrastructure, NATO civilian targets, that could trigger an Article 5 response from NATO as well. So, and I'm quite sure that that message is being conveyed to Mr. Putin too. So maybe that's good news. I don't want to leave you with good news.